What is something that's hated by drivers, despised by emergency personnel, yet so common as to be almost forgotten, and yet we're still arguing about it over 100 years after its introduction as to whether it's a good idea or not? Well, of course I am talking about the speed bump. Who would do a video about something as boring as that?
All right, so welcome back to All Cars Y'all, and today we're going to be doing a brief history, but a shockingly long history of the speed bump. Now, all of these are called traffic calming devices, and they come in many shapes and sizes and different approaches. And today we're going to talk about the three basic varieties of them: the speed bump, the speed hump, and the speed table. They go by different names around the world, and we'll touch on that here in a minute. But from a perspective of history, they're actually long-lived. During the excavations of Pompeii, they actually found the first traffic calming devices, essentially the ancestor of the speed bump. The streets had raised blocks in the middle of them, so pedestrians could cross from one side to the other, while the carts on the street had to navigate, slow down, and get their wheels between the blocks. It was essentially the first speed bump. But in modern times, the first speed bump can be traced back to 1906 in Chatham, New Jersey. They were tired of people speeding down Main Street and decided to raise the crosswalks by 5 inches. Now, there were no slopes on either side of them. They just raised it essentially by a layer of bricks, which means it was a very harsh transition. And this was at a time when the cars that were on the road were like the Oldsmobile Curve Dash or the Ford Model N that had top speed of 20 or 30 miles an hour, but it exceeded the speed limit on the street of 10 miles an hour. Now, eventually those fell out of favor. Everybody got tired of how harsh they were, and they were actually removed. But when these were installed, it got not only local attention, but national news attention with a write-up in the New York Times. So, people speed. It's an unfortunate fact of life, and traffic engineers and safety advocates have realized that all the signs and markings in the world don't cause some people to slow down. So why not put a physical obstacle that makes them actually feel it? That's the logic behind the speed bump. And we fast forward to 1953, and there's a physicist, Arthur Holly Compton. He was frustrated with speeding cars at Washington University in St. Louis, where he worked. He happened to have won the Nobel Prize in 1927, and he decided to apply his physics knowledge to develop the design for a single and a double bump with angled sides and a 7-inch rise in the middle, and he named it the traffic control bump. Initially, it was banned on public roads but allowed on private properties. The first speed bump in Europe was in 1970 in the Netherlands and spread slowly throughout Europe in the 70s, and the first example in the UK was installed in 1983. Now, the speed bump goes by many names, such as the sleeping policeman in English, the judder bar in New Zealand, and the lying down policeman in the Balkans. From these slow adoption beginnings, variations have arisen to address concerns with the design as well as newer traffic calming approaches. Here, it's important to distinguish the three variations we're going to be talking about: the speed bump, the speed hump, and the speed table. The speed bump is the most abrupt, at about 3 to 4 inches tall and about 1 to 3 feet wide. They're intended for use in parking lots and at low speed, low volume neighborhood roads, and they slow speeds down to about 5 to 10 miles an hour. Today, speed bumps can be formed on site by crews from asphalt, or versions of it are available in recycled rubber or in plastic, typically with a lower rise, and they can be bought in sections and literally just bolted into place by your street crews. Unsurprisingly, they have several disadvantages, among which are discomfort to drivers and passengers, increasing traffic noise from the tires and engine noise. They could encourage drivers to take more residential streets just to avoid them, and more seriously, they slow the response time of emergency vehicles who have to navigate across them. A more modern criticism of them is that they rather substantially increase pollution, as drivers have to slow down and then accelerate on the other side, and it increases fuel usage, not by an insignificant amount. Helping to address these concerns, also to be applicable on higher volume and perhaps higher speed roads, the speed hump was developed. While still rising the same 3 to 4 inches as the bump, it's spread out over 12 to 14 feet typically, making a much more comfortable transition. These can reduce travel speeds by about 10 miles an hour and are applicable on roads with speeds up to about 35 miles per hour, but they can be far more accommodating to mass transit and to emergency vehicles. Like the speed bump, signage and pavement markings are critical to notify drivers, especially in low light conditions. While more comfortable, the speed hump has most of the same criticisms, such as slowing emergency vehicles, but with our vehicles becoming larger and heavier, the hump has less impact on us, while still possibly being damaged by snow plows in those snowy climates that I don't want to have anything to do with. Also, like the speed bump, it can be installed on site with asphalt, and variations of the hump are available pre-manufactured and in various materials and sizes. One variation of the speed hump is the speed cushion, like a hump with gaps, placed on the road such that smaller vehicles have to slow to navigate them. Larger and wider vehicles like fire trucks or ambulances can safely straddle them. Next, we have the speed table, which is essentially a speed hump with a wide flat top or a raised crosswalk with slope sides. Still typically used in areas with residential speed limits, they often allow the full wheelbase of the vehicle to be on the hump and are often marketed as pedestrian crossings. In my area, when installed, they often have a brick pattern embedded and painted as a crosswalk pattern so that they can be as wide as an intersection. Oh, and in Australia, they're called a wombat crossing, but I think that humans can still use them. Speed tables allow a 20 to 30 mile an hour speed, but studies have shown a 45% decrease in accidents at them, and in Australia, they've been shown to reduce casualties by 63%. So what does the future hold for these speed bumps and traffic calming devices? Well, there's been several innovations along the way. A Swedish company has an active bump. So if you're going a set speed, it stays flat and you can continue. But if you're going a little too fast, it can actually lower down and create a bump for you. The one I like the most is a Spanish company that offers an active bump filled with a non-Newtonian fluid. It's essentially a rubber chamber with a non-Newtonian fluid. And non-Newtonian is at a slow enough speed, the fluid pushes out of the way and you can continue on comfortably. But if you're going too fast, the fluid actually hardens up for a moment and creates the bump, making it a little more uncomfortable for you and encouraging you to slow down. Both of these have their disadvantages, specifically in installation and maintenance costs. And I have to say that Spanish one with a more rubberized housing around it, I wonder how much that's going to cost and how long it's going to last. But there's other methods that traffic engineers use to slow traffic down at these residential speeds. They use rumble strips, which are more used for rural areas because they add increased noise, which city dwellers seem to not like. There's roundabouts, and that one deserves its own video simply because roundabouts are much, much safer than four-way intersections, but they're also used for traffic calming to keep the speed down. And I personally, as a former engineer, do not think that planners should be in charge of traffic control devices. It should be an engineering decision, not a, hey, let's put one every intersection just to slow people down. There's also speed feedback signs. We've all seen those telling you what the speed limit is and how fast you're going. And finally, the road diet, which essentially is a lane that just disappears so that you have to slow down to deal with it. While we all hate them, the speed bump over time forces us to slow down to almost a stop or go just fast enough to almost glide over them if you have the appropriate vehicle for it, but don't try this in your Honda Civic. The speed hump and speed table are far more comfortable to drive across, and as a former engineer, I'm actually a big fan of them. They naturally impose a lower speed limit while also helping maintain traffic flow and volume. And I'm excited for some of these newer options, especially that Spanish one with the non-Newtonian fluid in it, while I do question the longevity and the maintenance of the material, which brings me to one criticism that all three options have that, well, in my research, I've not found anybody to bring up, and that is very low sports cars trying to navigate across speed bumps or speed humps. Apparently, if you are crossing a speed hump in your Ferrari and crying, well, you are crying alone. So thanks so much for being here, and a special thanks to my patrons whose support helps make videos like this about something like a speed bump absolutely possible. If you like this video and if you feel like I've earned it, please give it a thumbs up. Please consider subscribing. If you absolutely loved it and want to see more like this, please consider supporting the channel. Thanks so much for being here, y'all. I appreciate your time.